Welcome to the debate. Today we're confronting the lasting economic consequences stemming from the UK's withdrawal from the European Union. We're anchoring our discussion really on the core thesis that the departure functions as a kind of slow puncture on the national economy, creating persistent and structural headwinds ever since the implementation of the Trade and Cooperation Agreement, the TCA, back in 2021. So, our central question is this. Has the departure resulted in systemic, perhaps irreversible damage to the UK's long-term economic structure? Damage that's fundamentally visible through, say, stagnant productivity and collapsed investment. Or, conversely, is the pain we're actually measuring simply an asymmetric rebalancing, where, the documented resilience of key sectors, particularly services, mitigates the overall structural impact and maybe points toward future adaptation? Now, I intend to argue that the cumulative evidence, it confirms a fundamental and permanent downgrade to the UK's economic potential.
And I think we need to inject some necessary nuance into that assessment. While I fully acknowledge that new frictions and, yes, costs were introduced by the TCA, I believe the data shows a much more complex, asymmetric impact. It's one concentrated heavily in legacy sectors. And this suggests, to me at least, that the economy is successfully reorienting itself toward existing strengths, specifically services and non-EU trade. And that profoundly challenges the severity of the long-term, irreversible structural harm that the whole systemic damage thesis really relies upon.
Okay, well, let's start with the macro picture then, because the cumulative evidence is now substantial. It points directly to a structural loss of national income and productivity capacity, exactly in line, actually, with the warnings from the OBR, that's the Office for Budget Responsibility. If we want a clean measure of the distinct economic cost of Brexit, I think we have to look at the UK's relative underperformance compared to its G7 peers. I mean, these nations all faced the same global shocks, the pandemic, the energy crisis, supply chain disruption, but only the UK combined these factors with a fundamental restructuring of its most important trade relationship. And when we track the true measure of a nation's prosperity, GDP per person, we see that it experienced a cumulative fall of 1.2% between the end of 2019 and early 2024. This confirms, really, that any headline GDP growth we see is essentially, flattered by a booming population. We are simply adding more people, not making the average worker more efficient or the average citizen wealthier. And that, I would argue, is the definition of a structural downgrade. And the OBR, they've consistently quantified this long-run reduction in productivity at 4% relative to remaining in the EU. Now, that's a figure that translates directly into an estimated $40 billion annual shortfall in tax revenues. That shortfall isn't temporary, it feels permanent. And the mechanism for this lasting damage, it seems, primarily transmitted through a sustained, profound loss of business confidence. Investment is the lifeblood of future productivity, right? And business investment has, it's flatlined since 2016. Growing less than 2% in the 9 quarters after the referendum, while every other G7 economy managed growth rates exceeding 6% in the same period. That's a stark difference.
Okay, I understand why you hang the core of your argument on investment and the OBR forecast. But that perspective, it sort of views the economy as a single monolithic entity, which I think misses the crucial asymmetry baked into the TCA itself. The new non-tariff barriers, the customs checks, the regulatory divergence, yes, they were applied brutally to goods trade, that much is clear. But the new agreement largely left the UK's primary economic strength, its services sector, comparatively resilient. If this were truly a generalized structural failure, as you suggest, we would expect generalized failure across the board. Yet the UK remains the world's second largest services exporter. Services trade hasn't stalled. Actually, it has soared, growing by an exceptional 14% between 2019 and 2023. Now, this is a faster rate of growth than seen in economic powerhouses like the US, France, or Japan over the same period.
This robust performance in the largest sector, it acts as a powerful counterbalance to the investment slump you cite, showing perhaps that capital and dynamism are being deployed elsewhere, Yes, okay. If we look at the trade average, UK trade volumes only grew 1% compared to 8% for the G7. But that average is, I think, deceiving. It masks a massive sectoral divergence. Goods exports contracted by over 13%, while services grew 14%. So the impact is sectoral friction, not a systemic loss of global confidence. Moreover, focusing entirely on lost EU trade ignores the principle of economic gravity. You know, the idea that trade is inherently local and friction sensitive. The minimal projected gains from new trade deals, like the, 0.08% GDP bump from the Australia deal, they simply confirm that economic reality. It's not proof of systemic failure. It's proof that distance and friction matter, and frankly, they always have.
I see the power of your argument regarding services resilience, I do. But I worry you're treating services as, well, as an entity, somehow decoupled from the broader macroeconomic realities. It is fundamental investment that drives overall productivity, and that is where the structural issue really lies. The OBR explicitly attributes 2/5 of that total 4% long-run productivity hit, not just to trade barriers, but to the pervasive uncertainty that preceded the TCA, which, choked off investment decisions for years. Services, strong as they are, cannot possibly compensate for the lack of capital formation across the broader economy. When we talk about investment flatlining, we mean that businesses aren't buying the new machines, the new software, or building the new infrastructure necessary to make workers more efficient in the future. So we are left with a smaller, older, and less productive capital stock tomorrow. That suppression of productivity capacity is structural, regardless of how well the financial and professional services sectors are performing today.
That perspective assumes that investment capital has simply vanished. That's a compelling argument for stagnation, I grant you. But have you considered the possibility that the stagnation you observe actually reflects businesses rationally reorienting that capital? Maybe they're moving it away from legacy EU-facing manufacturing supply chains, areas now burdened by friction, and directing it toward the growing services and non-EU trade sectors. Now, this capital reorientation, it takes time, and global shocks certainly haven't helped speed things up. But we can already see adaptation in the labor market. While, yes, we have acute shortages in low-skill areas like hospitality and agriculture, a direct consequence of restricted movement, the stated political ambition of forcing a high-wage, high-skill economy has arguably materialized in strong nominal wage growth, recently hitting 4.7%. Now, if the corresponding investment in automation and training is delayed, the system is still aggressively adjusting its cost space. The economy is responding to the new regulatory constraints by shedding low-wage reliance, even if the desired productivity boost hasn't fully materialized yet. The system is adjusting costs. I'd argue it is not collapsing. And let's push further on this definition of systemic failure. If the damage was truly systemic, a generalized inability for the UK economy to function, we would expect uniform economic failure across all regions, right? But the sharp divergence we see between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK fundamentally challenges that systemic damage thesis. Northern Ireland, due to the Windsor Framework, retained effective access to the EU single market for goods. And what was the result? Northern Ireland recorded 2.1% real GDP growth in 2023. That is 7 times the UK's overall growth rate of 0.3% that same year.
This accidental economic experiment, as some call it, proves beyond a reasonable doubt, I think, that maintaining deep single market access is a powerful driver of performance. So the UK's economic choice, while unquestionably costly, was specific. It was the voluntary sacrifice of frictionless access by Great Britain. It wasn't necessarily an intrinsic, generalized structural failure of the entire UK economic model.
That is a fascinating way to frame the Northern Ireland experience, certainly. But rather than suggesting the situation is manageable, I would argue the Northern Ireland scenario serves as the perfect control group. It powerfully underscores the exact value lost by Great Britain when it chose to prioritize regulatory autonomy over economic integration. It proves the massive cost of the choice, not the mitigation available to the rest of the nation. Moreover, the promised upside of that regulatory autonomy, the so-called Brexit dividend, well, it has utterly failed to materialize to offset these acknowledged costs. The government's own smarter regulation agenda projects annual savings of barely £1 billion. That figure is absolutely dwarfed by the administrative burden placed on businesses. I mean, we're talking about an estimated $15 billion annual cost just for new customs declarations alone. Regulatory sovereignty has simply created new, expensive non-tariff barriers.
Take UK REACH, the decision to duplicate the EU's chemicals regime. It's estimated to cost industry £2 billion and hasn't led to any real regulatory innovation. It has simply duplicated bureaucracy. So we traded frictionless access for bureaucratic cost, and the cost is clearly massively outstripping the purported dividend. And this slow puncture idea, it's not abstract. It is most acutely felt by the small and medium-sized enterprises, the SMEs, which are, the true backbone of our economy and the traditional source of dynamism. The research from the LSC here is damning. The number of active trading relationships between UK and EU firms fell by nearly a third in the first 6 months of the TCA. And this drop was driven almost entirely by smaller firms deciding it was no longer worth the hassle to export. You talk about adaptation, but for an SME, the administrative burden is, well, it can be lethal.
The sheer complexity of new customs procedures, the headache of VAT administration, the extreme complexity of rules of origin requirements, which dictate what percentage of a product must be made domestically, this has blocked the crucial nursery function the EU market used to provide for small exporters. This isn't just lost paperwork. It leads directly to the relocation of economic activity out of the UK. I mean, the jewelry company that moved its distribution hub to Poland is just one example that gets cited often. When the smaller players retreat like this, that represents a fundamental, long-term drag on future dynamism and potential growth capacity.
I agree that the SME burden is significant and the paperwork complexity is real, no question. But relocation, while obviously damaging to specific communities, is ultimately a rational, perhaps short-term, strategic adjustment to market friction. It's businesses optimizing their supply chains in response to new rules. I don't see it necessarily as an irreversible collapse of our trade capacity. What gives me slightly more confidence, perhaps, is the political environment now. We are seeing a pragmatic shift towards friction management. The new government seems to be prioritizing agreements specifically designed to ease these pain points, such as pursuing a sanitary and phytosanitary, or SPS, agreement to reduce checks on agri-food products and striving for mutual recognition for professional qualifications to smooth services trade. These are focused incremental fixes, a bit like the Green Lane system implemented for Northern Ireland under the Windsor Framework. They demonstrate that the path forward is one of actively managing and mitigating friction within the confines of the TCA, rather than simply accepting irreversible damage. The political red lines regarding the single market and customs union are constraints. Yes, absolutely. But within those constraints, pragmatic repair is both possible and now seems politically prioritized.
Ultimately, though, the core metrics paint a picture that I think mitigation efforts cannot fully erase. The evidence of underperformance across GDP per capita, the chronic, decade-long investment stagnation, and the confirmed OBR productivity loss of 4%, these establish that the UK has suffered a profound and costly structural change. While the sectoral success in services provides a welcome counterpoint, sure, it is not sufficiently broad or deep to offset the deep-seated weaknesses and persistent inflationary pressure inflicted across the broader economy. We have, I believe, fundamentally lowered our national economic ceiling, and the challenge now is operating beneath that new, lower ceiling.
The economic picture is, as we've discussed, undeniably complex and highly asymmetric. The substantial 14.0% growth in services trade and the frankly impressive outperformance of Northern Ireland's dual market access prove that significant structural capacity remains strong where deep economic integration was preserved. The most acute pain is concentrated in goods and SME trade, driven by specific political choices on regulatory divergence and the associated costs of friction. The debate, therefore, perhaps should shift from merely quantifying this idea of systemic failure to focusing on determining the most efficient pragmatic policy adjustments, like accelerating those SPS agreements and mutual recognition deals to capitalize on the UK's inherent global strengths, but doing so within the specific constraints of the current TCA framework.
Right, both the harsh comparative analysis against G7 peers and the unique real-world control group provided by Northern Ireland, they do powerfully illuminate the enduring, substantial economic trade-offs inherent in the UK's post-EU reality. The costs are tangible and, I maintain, structural.
And understanding the exact nature of that trade-off and knowing precisely where the friction points are most acute, such as an SME administration, that is absolutely essential for developing effective, targeted policy, rather than perhaps being paralyzed by the quantification of a single, generalized systemic failure.